All right, happy Friday. Welcome back, Concepts in Training. Diving into the concept of the lactate threshold, or just what lactate and lactic acid is. But we're gonna talk about the lactate threshold because it kind of helps us get a barrier, kind of a barometer, I guess is probably the better term for it, a barometer on what lactate and lactic acid really is. So when we look at the lactate threshold, all right, so your body has three different main energy production systems. You have aerobic, you have anaerobic glycolysis, and you have basically a creatine phosphate anaerobic energy pathway. When we look at aerobic energy production, one of the byproducts of aerobic energy production is a pyruvate called lactate. So basically, what happens is your body goes through this process where it makes ATP, and then a byproduct of that is lactate. Now, lactate ends up coming back in what's called the Krebs cycle to get re-upped and reused to then keep making ATP. Your aerobic work, when you're doing stuff, well, all of a sudden what you start to get is you get this buildup of lactate, and it keeps getting reabsorbed and reused to continue to increase ATP production, okay? So what happens is you get to a certain point where you basically, that first step of the cycle, where you start creating so much lactate, you start to get this burning sensation, you start to get this overload of lactate. Well, that's what we call your lactate threshold. And it's the point at which you produce too much lactate that can't be reabsorbed into the cycle and reabsorbed into the system, so you start to dive into an anaerobic state. Now, this is really important, especially when we're trying to build aerobic endurance. It's important when we're trying to build anaerobic power or anaerobic capacity, basically the ability to repeat anaerobic power outputs, is being able to understand and how to train within and either under and or above a lactate threshold, because this, and the kind of the real nice equation is basically the point where you want to quit and die is about the point you find the lactate threshold to occur. So when we start to look at trying to train, especially when we're trying to build up that aerobic endurance, if we cross that lactate threshold, we're no longer aerobically doing anything and we're not building up that aerobic capacity. If we're spending too much time in a lactate threshold, we start to not increase our ability to utilize oxygen because we're not actually doing any more aerobic work. Like, we have capped out that ability. So if we're trying to build aerobic endurance, we're trying to train beneath that lactate threshold. We can get close, and we might even try to get as close as we can, but we're not trying to actually dip past that threshold. If we're trying to build anaerobic power, we are trying to be above that threshold, and then recovering and taking a decent amount of time to dip back below, let that metabolic waste clear out, because it doesn't actually hang out for like 24 hours like your old football coach used to say. So when we start to look at lactic acid, it's really not even an acid, but they'll give it that name because it burns. When we start to look at trying to increase different capacities, now if we're going to try to increase anaerobic capacity, which is the ability to repeat anaerobic power, now we're going to start to feel a little bit of that burn more, because we're not going to fully let that system recover, and we're not going to let that lactate flush out. So we're going to kind of get used to this buffer, or this accumulation of lactate. And so the more we get used to that, the more we develop that quality. So a lot of times I sit on the bike doing this because this is my favorite tool to expose the lactate threshold and to work either aerobically or anaerobically, because just the more you kind of toy with the intensity of it, then the more we dip into each range. So when we start to look at those, that's really what that burning feeling you feel is. That's what lactate or lactate acid is. It's really just like a metabolite that will get reabsorbed if you're working aerobically. And if not, it's going to start to burn a little bit because you're going to cross the lactate threshold, which means that you're going to start working anaerobically. Just kind of one of those broad spectrum topics for this week's Concepts in Training.